All right, so we are going to be back in Daniel, the book of Daniel this morning. We're going to be in chapter 3. As I mentioned earlier, most people this morning are celebrating and remembering Jesus Christ's resurrection. And that's a great thing we can do today and every day. But Joey and I decided that we were going to continue in Daniel this morning because we're working on together looking at the life of Jesus Christ and going through all 4 of the Gospels maybe later this year. So we'll be looking at his death and resurrection when we're going through all of that. So today we just decided to stay in the 3rd chapter of Daniel. So we are in Daniel chapter 3. Last time, remember, we read Nebuchadnezzar had this very odd dream. He was concerned about it. He wanted an interpretation of it, and the resolution of that was that God helped Daniel to know what the dream was, what the interpretation was, and the king was blessed, and Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael were blessed as well. This record, chapter 3, is one that you're all familiar with. It is not one that Daniel is part of. This is the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his giant golden statue and the fiery furnace. And it only involves Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. However, this chapter of the Bible calls them not by their Hebrew names, but by their Babylonian names. It only mentions them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So that's the names we'll use today, even though we like the Hebrew names better. Those are the ones we'll use today because it'll just be less confusing. Okay, before we jump in and start reading this chapter, which everyone I know is very familiar with, you could probably tell me the story yourself, I want to give you a little bit of background. There is a lot of debate amongst Christian historians and biblical scholars about when this record in the Bible actually takes place. Some people believe that it happened very soon after Daniel interpreted that dream for Nebuchadnezzar. Other people feel like it happened much later. There's actually a 40-year window between the years about 602 BC and 562 BC that people believe that this could have taken place. So we're not really sure, but that's okay. But during that 40-year period, there was a lot going on in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was busy. He was mostly busy attacking other people. Here are some things that he was doing during this 40-year time period. In 601 BC, Nebuchadnezzar unsuccessfully attempts to invade Egypt. So remember, we read in chapter 1, Egypt had invaded Babylon when he was still a prince, and now he's going and trying to invade Egypt. Then in 597, Nebuchadnezzar captures Jerusalem. Remember from chapter 1, he had started attacking Jerusalem, and he did take some of those young men out, including Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But he stopped the campaign because his father died, and he had to go back to Babylon to claim the throne. So he attacks them again, and he does capture Jerusalem this time. And then over the next 10 years, he deports more Jews to Babylon. In 586, from 586 BC to 572, so that's an 8-year period, Nebuchadnezzar besieges Tyre unsuccessfully, and Tyre was a very rich and powerful city that was near actually Jerusalem. It was in this little strip of land between Egypt and Asia. But he was unsuccessful. He fought for 8 years and never conquered them. In 585, Nebuchadnezzar's armies destroy the Phoenician settlement at Tel Kabri. So he destroyed another settlement. And then in 575, Nebuchadnezzar built the Ishtar Gate and the Great Walls of Babylon. And that's something we've been studying in our history this year. I want to just read a little bit about it. You can look up. They have found the Ishtar Gate, and they have made, based on, I guess, writings and descriptions, replicas that you can look up, and it's really beautiful, the replicas they've made of what this gate looked like. But I'll just read you a couple of sentences out of our little history book about the Ishtar Gate and about the walls. So it says, the great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar spent much of his reign making Babylon beautiful again. He built huge walls all around the city to keep it safe from invasion. In one of the walls, he built a great blue gate decorated with yellow and white bulls and dragons, and named it after Babylon's chief goddess, Ishtar. Underneath this gate, a great parade passed every year in honor of Ishtar, and the gate became famous all through Nebuchadnezzar's empire. So he made that in 575 BC. All right, another thing I wanted to talk about before we jump into this chapter, a question that came to my mind, and I think, and as I was researching, a lot of other people had the same question: where is Daniel during this record? He's not mentioned at all. The short answer is we don't know where Daniel was. But I think, based on what we know about Daniel and his character, I think we can safely say he was not present at this event, which was not in Babylon. It was on the plains of Dura, which we don't really know where that is either. There's a lot of controversy over where Dura was. But he was, I think we can safely say he was not there. We know enough about his character to know that if he was there, he would have been standing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he would not have been bowing down, and he would have been among the ones that the Chaldeans then accused. We're going to read about. So we don't know exactly where he was. I think we can safely say he was not present. Things to keep in mind as we read today. Just as a reminder, we talked about this when we read chapter 1. Remember, these are real people who really lived, who really went through these situations, and they had real feelings, they had real strengths, and they had real shortcomings, just like we do. Also, keep in mind that these men stood firm and spent 3 years, remember, eating pulse. Remember what pulse was? Pulse was the food they fed to the livestock. They ate the pulse, remember, for 3 years, and they drank water instead of the food that was dedicated to the false gods, and they saw God bless them for their faithfulness to him in that situation. They had also prayed with Daniel. Remember in chapter 2, Daniel calls them together to pray with him, to have Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its interpretation revealed. And they saw how God protected and blessed them in that situation. So perhaps those experiences helped them to grow in their believing and in their trust in God, which in turn maybe helped them when facing this next great challenge that we're going to read about today. Okay? All right. Let's jump into verse 1. And Jeannie, will you read verse 1 for us?
Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar makes this statue. And its height was 80 cubits, and the breadth was 6 cubits. So a score is equal to the number 20. So if it says it was 80 cubits high, how many cubits is that? 60. 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. Okay, so a cubit, just so you have an idea, is about 18 inches. If you want to be exact, it's 17.49 inches. And so when we talk about that, and I rounded to the nearest foot, it was about 9 feet wide, and it was about 88 feet tall. So it was really skinny and really tall. And so I didn't do it in inches because it would have been as tall as me. But I did it in centimeters just to give you an idea. And I just did it as a rectangle because I'm not an artist. But so if we're talking about something that's 1 centimeter here equals 1 cubit, we have 6 centimeters across and 60 up. That's kind of tall and skinny, like you kind of wonder how it didn't fall over kind of thing. That's what we're talking about here. This is the kind of image he made. It was tall and thin. It also says that the statue was made of gold. Now, in reading, some of commentaries that I read said that because it was so large, it may not have been made of solid gold. But it could have been wood that was overlaid with gold, and that was a common method of construction in the ancient world. So it could have been a solid gold statue, but it may also have been wood with gold over the top of it. Now, this is not in the Bible. We don't know this for sure, but some biblical historians have speculated that perhaps Nebuchadnezzar made this statue in response to his dream that he had had in chapter 2.
But they noted too, interesting though, that he chose to make his entire statue of gold. Remember, the gold portion represented Nebuchadnezzar in the dream. So they thought it was interesting, if that was his motivation, which we don't know for sure, that he chose to make his statue entirely of gold instead of only partially of gold. And as I mentioned earlier, this happened. He made this on the plain of Dura, and we don't know exactly where that is. There's a lot of different opinions about where exactly Dura was located. Okay. Joey, will you read verses 2 and 3, please?
Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, and the captains, and the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up.
So he calls all these different officials and other important government people from all, remember he oversaw 129 provinces, all to come to the dedication of this statue. And again, we don't know, because the Bible doesn't tell us his motivation, but again, some biblical scholars have speculated that it may have been a test of allegiance. If they were going to be loyal to Nebuchadnezzar and the empire by obeying this command to travel all this way and to come to this dedication and then to do what he's about to ask them to do. So, all right, and Lily, verses 4 and 5, please.
Then an herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up." Yes.
Now, this list of instruments tells us that this was a really big event. This would be the equivalent to you having a large orchestra present to play at your ceremony. This was a big deal. This was a lot of musical instruments and a lot of musicians. All right. Emmy, will you read verse 6?
And
whoso falleth
not down and worship shall the same
hour
be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace.
Okay, this command from Nebuchadnezzar about when you hear this music play, you're to fall down and worship, was backed up by a pretty powerful threat, right? Nebuchadnezzar regarded the refusal to worship as treason, not just as a religious offense. He was taking it against the crown and against, the empire. In this, Nebuchadnezzar was just like many politicians who often seem willing to use religion to strengthen their grip on political power. Politicians are happy to blend together spiritual allegiance and national allegiance. An example of this was displayed in 1936 when Herr Baldur von Schirach, head of the youth program for Nazi Germany, said, "If we act as true Germans, we act according to the laws of God. Whoever serves Adolf Hitler, the Fuhrer, serves Germany, and whoever serves Germany serves God." Another example comes from 1960 when the president of Ghana had a slightly larger than life-size statue of himself erected in front of the National House of Parliament. An inscription on the side of the statue read, "Seek first the political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto you." The statue was destroyed after a bloodless coup in 1966. Okay, let's talk for a minute, pause, and talk for just a minute about the fiery furnace. Some people question if there was actually a fiery furnace. They suggest that the fiery furnace was a metaphor for the difficult situation these men found themselves in. So what does history tell us about fiery furnaces? In an early excavation at Babylon, a strange building was discovered which initially appeared to be a firing kiln, much like those used to fire bricks and pottery. However, a cuneiform inscription. Cuneiform was that old kind of writing that kind of looked like pictures, remember? They found a cuneiform inscription on this building, and it revealed the purpose of this structure. Here's what the inscription said. This is the place of burning, where men who blasphemed the gods of Chaldea died by fire. And if you want to research that further, that quote is from Harry Rimmer's book, Dead Men Tell Tales. This archaeological discovery demonstrates that the scriptural account of the fiery furnace is consistent with the religious cultism of ancient Babylon. In addition, there is a cuneiform inscription in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. And we always laugh at his name. I don't know if I'm saying it right. It's in our Story of the World, and I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but that's how I say it. So he reigned, I know, it's hilarious, but that's how his name is spelled. So he reigned in Assyria from 668 to 627 BC, about 50 years before all of this may have been taking place. And he is known, this king is known for making the first library ever in the history of the world. But in his library, there was an inscription, and it was discovered at Nineveh about 100 years ago, and it's now housed at the British Museum. And here's what his inscription reads from his library. Salmagina, my rebellious brother, who made war with me, they threw into a burning fiery furnace and destroyed his life. And that's from Stephen Kiger's book, Bible and Spade. So, we don't know exactly what the fiery furnace looked like, but we do know from history that they did in fact exist. And so this is an accurate, this is accurate, and it fits with what God says in his word, which is there was a fiery furnace and they were going to get thrown into it. We don't know exactly what they look like because none are in their full state anymore. But it probably looks similar to an ancient kiln that would have been used to fire bricks or metals, which is why the one was confused. And I have a picture that I can post later for anybody to look at it. I didn't have a good way to print it and show you of one of these ancient firing kilns, so you can get kind of an idea of what this probably looked like. All right, let's jump back into verse 7, Summer.
Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up.
Okay, so we have a figure of speech in this verse that's important to understand, and it's called hendiatris, or 3 for 1. And so it's when 3 nouns, or sometimes maybe just 2 nouns, are used in place for an adjective, and you're trying to raise something to greater importance. So when it says all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped, is the rest of that. Languages don't fall down and worship, do they? Right? But what that means is all the people, and yes, people from all different nations who spoke all different languages, fell down and worshiped the golden image. The government officials and the other people who were there immediately obeyed Nebuchadnezzar's command. Okay? All right, verse 8, Heather.
Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews.
All right, that word accused in this verse is the Greek word va'achula, which literally translated means to eat or to devour. So this was not a neutral telling of information. These men's intentions were malicious, right? They were out to get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I thought it was interesting that here it said against the Jews, and this verse doesn't specify which Jews. We don't know that yet. We haven't gotten far enough in the chapter. And so then I have a question in my head that I don't have an answer for. Were these the only Jews that were present at this event? Were they the only officials that were Jewish that were at here? I don't have the answer to that, but I thought about it. I thought it was interesting. So, apparently, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's failure to worship the image was not discovered until these certain Chaldeans made it known. With so many thousands of government officials in attendance, we can understand how it would be easy for them to be overlooked, that they were ignoring this command. Additionally, we see from this that the 3 Jewish men did not lodge a formal protest. Remember, in chapter 1, with the food situation, they didn't just refuse to eat, right? Daniel went and made a request. In this instance, they didn't go to Nebuchadnezzar and say, hey, we don't want to do that. They just quietly, on their own, refrained from worshiping this idol, right? Their actions were not public, but neither were they hidden. These 3 Hebrew men must have known that their actions would be discovered, yet they obeyed God rather than men. All right, Finn, verse 9.
He spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever.
Right, and this we saw, I believe it was in chapter 2, and it's synecdoche, right? It's part for the whole or whole for the part. And this, O king, live forever, essentially doesn't mean we think you're going to live forever. It's long live the king, right? Okay, verses 10 through 12. Jordan, you want to read those?
Thou king hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of a cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worship, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy God, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the Chaldeans come to King Nebuchadnezzar, and after they've greeted him with, O king, live forever, they remind him of the decree that he made. I just find that so humorous. We'll see that again with Daniel in the lion's den. They remind the king of what he did. And they also specifically call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by name as persons who have not obeyed the king's command, right? All right, Eli, will you read verses 13 and 14?
Then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they brought them before the king. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king spoke and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my God, nor worship the golden image which I have set up?
Right. Now, to his credit, Nebuchadnezzar didn't take the word of these Chaldeans, right? He made sure of it with a personal interview. This was possibly an even greater challenge for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's one thing to quietly make a stand for God, and it's another thing to stick to your stand when you're pointedly asked, is it true that you did that? These verses also have a figure of speech. It's called erotesis of expostulation. Now, that's a mouthful. Now, but remember, we talked about erotesis. We talked about erotesis of prohibition when we read Daniel chapter 1. And in erotesis of prohibition, remember, it's kind of like a rhetorical question where you're not expecting an answer. And instead, the question's intended to emphasize the speaker's feelings or make the speaker's point even more clear. In Daniel chapter 1, remember the question was from the eunuch who was like, how can I do this? The king will have my head, kind of thing. And he was essentially saying, we can't do this. I don't want to get my head chopped off because I didn't take care of you the right way. In this chapter, however, we have erotesis of expostulation. Expostulation is a really big word that means to reason earnestly with a person for the purposes of dissuading them or forcefully reproaching them. In this kind of erotesis, a question is being asked where you're confidently expecting the response to your question to be negative. So in other words, the speaker's asking a question and they're fully expecting the answer to the question to be no. So when Nebuchadnezzar says, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up?" He's asking that question. He's fully expecting them to say, "Oh, no, we worship your gods. It's not a problem." That's the response he's expecting from them. Okay? All right, verse 15, Ron.
If you be ready that at what time ye shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, buttsack, psaltery, and the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye shall fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast in the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?
Yes. Okay. This verse has a figure of speech called ellipsis of contrary words. And it's where an omitted word is supplied from a contrary word. I want to show you some examples, and I want to talk about this verse. So if you want to flip with me, you can. If you don't want to, that's fine. We're just going to the book of Psalms, and I'm going to read you a couple of examples of this figure of speech that are very, very clear, so that you can understand how this works. The first one is Psalm chapter 7 and verse 11. And it says, so this is where an omitted word is supplied from a contrary word. You don't have both positive and negative or the either or. Only one word is supplied. The other word is kind of understood. It says, God judgeth the righteous and is angry. That's not the right one. Okay. I don't know. Let me skip over that one. Maybe I wrote that one down wrong because that one doesn't make sense with what we're doing. Let me try 65:8. Sorry, y'all. It happens. All right. All right, never mind. I don't understand what I've written here. We're moving on. We won't do it. Okay, but in this instance, in verse 15, the ellipsis that should have been omitted has been supplied by the English translators. This word well is not in the Greek lexicon. There is no word for well or good. So in other words, he just pauses here. Now, if ye be ready that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Nothing. I'm not going to tell you. But if you worship not, you shall be cast in the same hour in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? And the pause is actually another kind of figure of speech. It's called aposiopesis, and it's called a sudden silence. It's the sudden breaking off of what is being said or written so that the mind may be more impressed by what is too wonderful or solemn or awful for words. Or when a thing may be, as we sometimes say, better imagined than described. It's used to call our attention to what's being said for the purpose of pressing us with its importance. So this idea, this ellipsis of contrary words, the either, an or, and this sudden silence go to emphasize the situation. So he's not even going to say, now if you're ready to obey, I'm not going to tell you what the end of that is. I'm just pausing. But if you don't, I'm going to tell you it's going to be awful. The opposite is awful, right? We're reflecting on the if I don't, what's going to happen. Bullinger, in talking about verse 15, says Nebuchadnezzar was ready with his threat of the punishment, but he was careful not to commit himself to any promise of what would happen if they obeyed his command and worshipped the golden image. The last thing I wanted to point out about this verse is that the question at the end of this verse where he says, and who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? It sounds like erotesis to me. But Bullinger doesn't call it that, so it must not be that. However, I think we can accurately reword the question into an emphatic statement. There is no God who can deliver you out of my hands. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are faced with a choice to stick to their guns and take a stand for the one true God, or to compromise and bow down and worship the golden statue. We can imagine the enormous pressure on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to compromise in this situation. Think about it. Everything in front of them, the king, the furnace, the music, their accusers, all the witnesses who had already obeyed the king's command, all of it conspired to convince them to compromise. In a situation like this, it is easy to think of 1,000 excuses that seem to justify making a compromise. They might have said, "There's nothing to gain by resisting. Wouldn't we do more good by living? We're in a different place. When in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do. We will lose our jobs and our standard of living. After all, we're not being called to renounce our God. We're not bowing down to the idol, but only bowing down in respect for the king or in honor of the music. Everybody else is doing it. It's only for once and not very long, 10 minutes just for the king. It is foolish to throw our lives away for just 10 minutes. Or, this is too much to expect of us. God will understand just this once." So let's go to verse 16, Dad.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king of Nebuchadnezzar, "We are not careful to answer thee in this matter."
Yes, the Lamb's version reads this way: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "There is no use to answer you concerning this matter." They had no need to defend themselves. Their guilt was clear. They clearly would not bow down to this image. And verse 17, Mom?
"If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king."
Okay, so these men showed a good understanding and appreciation of God's great power. In fact, they knew that God was able to deliver them both from the fiery furnace and from the hand of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Their stand was firm. God can and will deliver us. Verse 18, Cassidy.
"But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up."
Okay, this is what the Lambda reads. "Then the king shall know that we will not serve your God, nor worship the golden image which you have set up." Now that's different from what we have in the King James, where it says, "but if not." Like, if God doesn't save us, we're still not going to do it. Lambda says, "Then the king shall know that we shall not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up." So I looked it up, and the Greek word translated as know or known in this verse is yadia, which is from the Aramaic word yada, and that means to know, certify, or to make known. Also, in the Greek lexicon, there is no negative word that could be translated as not. So with this information, I believe that the Lambda translation is the better translation of this verse. And what a wonderfully bold statement. Think about it. There is no room for negative thinking in the Lambda translation. In the Lambda translation, there is no consideration of the possibility that God might not come through for them. Instead, it is a statement of complete and total believing. God can and will deliver us, and then you will know that we will not serve your God and worship your God. Period. So, I'm going to reread to you verses 16 through 18 using the Lambda translation. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "There is no use to answer you concerning this matter. For there is our God whom we serve. He is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Then the king shall know that we will not serve your God, nor worship the golden image which you have set up." All right, verse 19 reads, Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. So that word visage, or some translations say countenance, we're talking about his facial expression. His facial expression totally changes because now he's enraged that they flat out said, no, we're not going to worship. God's going to deliver us, and then you're going to know that we're definitely not going to worship. So his total face, his face changes because he's furious, and then he commands that this furnace should be heated 7 times hotter than it was intended to be heated. Okay? Let's see. Let's read verses 20 through 22. Jeannie, will you do 20 through 22?
Mm-hmm. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
All right, so he commands that his strongest men from his army tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so there's no chance of them escaping. And they carry them and throw them into the fiery furnace with all their clothes and their hats and everything on. And the fire, according to verse 22, was so hot that the men who got close to the fire to put them in the fire were killed by the fire. Lamsa has an interesting translation, and I tried to figure out how to use an online Aramaic or Hebrew lexicon to try to figure out where these words came from in this verse. I couldn't figure out how to do it. So I don't know whether the King James and some of these other translations we have are more accurate, or if this is accurate as well. But I thought it was very interesting, so I wanted to share. Here's what the Lamsa verse says. Because the king's command was hasty, this is verse 22. Because the king's command was hasty, and the furnace was exceedingly hot, the flames of the fire killed those who had accused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So I'm not sure, but if that happened, that's kind of interesting. Okay, Joey, will you read verses 23 and 24 for us?
And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished?
Yeah.
Okay, astonished. And rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king.
Okay, I want to read you 2 alternate translations of these 2 verses. The first is the Lamsa, and here's what the Lamsa says in verses 23 and 24. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And they rose up and walked bound in the midst of the flame, praising God and blessing the Lord. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was alarmed and rose up in a great fear and spoke and said to his princes, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. And the other translation I want to read you is the New English translation, and it's from the Septuagint. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but the Septuagint is the earliest translation we have into Greek from the Hebrew. So it's the earliest Greek translation that we have today. So this is an English translation from that Greek translation, and this is what the New English translation says. Then these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the midst of the burning furnace and walked in the midst of the flame, singing praises to God and blessing the Lord. And Nebuchadnezzar heard them singing praises, and he wondered, and rose up in haste and said to his nobles, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they said to the king, Yes, O king. So we can't be 100% sure which translation is most accurate because we don't have an original copy of these verses that were originally written down. That doesn't exist anymore. But these translations from Lamsa and the New English would make logical sense, okay? Nebuchadnezzar would have witnessed these men being thrown into this fiery furnace that had been heated 7 times hotter than it was supposed to be heated. And he would have assumed that just because of the heat of the fire, they would have died instantly. After all, the men that threw them in were killed just by being near the fire. He wouldn't have been like crouching and looking in to make sure they were dead. So then it would be logical that something drew his attention and caused him to take a second look. Voices praising or singing to God would certainly have startled him and drawn his attention. We don't know for sure, but I think those are interesting and certainly a logical way for that situation to have taken place. All right, let's look at verse 25. Lily, is it your turn? Okay.
He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God.
Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar asks, didn't we throw 3 people in there and weren't they tied up? And they say yes. And then he says, well, I see 4 men and they're not tied up and they're walking around in the middle of the fire and they're not getting hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. The Son of God is an idiom. Remember, an idiom is an expression that's specific to a certain group of people or even just an individual. And this idiom means an angel. There was an angel in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All right. Emmy, will you read verses 26 and 27?
Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire, and the governors and captains and the king's counselors began gathered together, saw these men upon bodies the fire had no power, nor was any hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them.
Right, and so this is, whenever we read this as a family at our house, we always point out, think about this. Their bodies weren't burned. Their clothes weren't burned. Their hair wasn't burned. And they didn't even have the smell of fire on them. When you have a campfire or a bonfire, if you've ever roasted marshmallows at somebody's house and you've hung out by the fire and then you go back inside, what do you smell like?
Fire.
Smoke. You smell like smoke. And those clothes smell like smoke until you put them in the washing machine and wash them. Okay? But these guys were in the middle of a fiery furnace that was heated 7 times hotter than it was supposed to be heated. And they'd been in there for at least a little bit because they were walking around and Nebuchadnezzar had to notice them and call them back out. And they didn't even smell like smoke. That's God's protection, guys. Also, I don't know why, because I have read this record a million times, and this is the first time it struck me that it wasn't just Nebuchadnezzar and these Chaldeans and maybe some of Nebuchadnezzar's guards that witnessed this. All of these, thousands maybe, of, governors and other political people and government officials that had traveled, they all witnessed this happen. That is so awesome. What a wonderful witness for the one true God. And it made me wonder if anybody's hearts were changed that day after witnessing that. That is just so cool. All right, I'm going to wrap up and read us the last 3 verses for today. Starting in verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants and trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill. He loves this. Y'all remember that from the other? He wanted to make people into dunghills in, I think, chapter 2. Because there is no other God that can deliver out of this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So once again, in this situation, Nebuchadnezzar, just like in chapter 2, he praises the one true God. He makes a decree concerning the one true God. Now, God doesn't want people to be like cut up and made into their houses into dunghills if they don't want to believe him. But this was Nebuchadnezzar's human response to this God is very powerful. And then, remember when we were talking about all the excuses that maybe you could make in your head as to why you should compromise? Did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lose their important jobs in the kingdom and their way of living? No! They got better jobs and a better standard of living at the end of all this because they were faithful to God and did the right thing even when everybody else was doing the wrong thing. So, all right, that was it for today. I'm going to close in prayer. God, thank you for this time together in your word, and just thank you again for this wonderful reminder of how you are just waiting to work mightily for us as we stand boldly for you. And thank you for examples like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who did not compromise, who spoke boldly to the king in this situation. And we're just so thankful to see how you delivered them and blessed them exceedingly abundantly above all that they probably could ask or think in that situation. So we're so thankful for that. Thank you for your word that we can study and put on in our hearts and minds and just be faithful with it in our everyday lives. I pray as we go out this week that we can hold these truths in our heart and stand boldly for you. I pray for opportunities to speak your word, and I just pray that each of us will have the right word at the right time to bless those around us and encourage them, uplift them, and maybe bring them to a greater knowledge of you and your Son, Jesus Christ. So thank you so much again for this time together, and we ask you to bless the rest of our day in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Mama.
Let me have a question.